Hi, my name is Mondi, and I'm a volunteer with the Epilepsy Foundation Northwest. Our next speaker will be Dr. Erica Johnson. Dr. Johnson is a psychologist and a certified rehabilitation counselor with 24 years of experience as a rehabilitation counselor and educator, 19 of which have been focused on serving individuals with epilepsy. In 1998, Dr. Johnson began working in the area of neurological disabilities, vocational rehabilitation, under the mentorship of Dr. Robert Frazier at the University of Washington. Subsequently, she attended the University of Wisconsin from 2001 to 2006, where she studied and worked with the neuropsychologist Dr. Bruce Herman on studies of adult and pediatric epilepsy. Her dissertation research focused on predictors of employment in adolescents with epilepsy. Since returning to the Pacific Northwest in 2008, Dr. Johnson has co-developed with Dr. Frazier the Epilepsy Self-Management Program, PACE, also known as the Program for Active Consumer Engagement. She also worked with clinical psychologists in various medical community settings, serving individuals with neurological, sensory, and orthopedic disabilities, as well as those with multiple complex disabilities, such as traumatic brain injury, chronic pain, and substance use. Currently, Dr. Johnson's practice areas include behavioral health and adjustments to disability, psychological and neuropsychological assessment, disability management, individual and group psychotherapy, and consultation and supervision. Please welcome Dr. Johnson.
Thanks, everybody. And thank you, Kevin, for inviting me to speak to all of you today. It's my pleasure to talk to you about the topic of epilepsy and children's education planning. I will give a little bit of a plug before I start on our PACES research. So you just heard in the prior speech from my colleague Bob Frazier in the Neurology Vocational Services Unit. He and I have co-developed the Program for Active Consumer Engagement in Epilepsy. And this is an 8-week group class, for lack of a better term, that covers a multitude of different topic areas and is focused both on providing education and information around different topics related to living well with epilepsy, but also teaching people coping strategies and working on targeted goals related to successful management of whatever bothers you or whatever you want to work on related to your epilepsy. And I see Jessica right here in the front row. Hi, Jessica, and Kevin have been really active participants in rolling out PACES through the Epilepsy Foundation Northwest. So if that's something you think you're interested in, we'd be happy to give you more information. At this point, the program is just developed for people age 18 and older. Unfortunately, I know I'm here to talk about kids, but so this is an adult-focused program. And without further delay, I will talk to you now about epilepsy and children's education. And just so I can get a sense of who's here, I'm curious how many people in the room are parents of somebody 18 and younger who has epilepsy? Okay. And how many are here who are 18 and under or being served in the public school system right now with epilepsy? All right. Nurses. Do we have any nurses? Awesome. Wow. Okay. Good. Good. All right. So I've targeted this mostly towards parents and young people with epilepsy, but hopefully for the nurses, this will be either confirmatory to your knowledge base or help with that as well. So what I'll be talking about today is something called Section 504 and explaining what that is. I'll also be talking to you about the IDEA and what that is, and the plans or educational infrastructure, if you will, related to each. So Section 504, and this is the way you'll most commonly hear about it in the school system, is part of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, and probably the most important thing that distinguishes Section 504 from IDEA, or the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is that Section 504 is a civil rights statute. And this civil rights statute applies for students in both the primary school system, so thinking K through 12, and it also applies into secondary education, so students who are at the collegiate level. And the function of civil rights statute, especially Section 504, is to eliminate disability discrimination within school settings. The statute is enforced by the U.S. Department of Education within the Office of Civil Rights, or I'll refer to it as OCR as I'm talking to you today. And just for a matter of additional understanding, OCR also enforces Title II of the ADA and amendments of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which applies to state and local government programs, including public schools. So you can be thinking of Section 504 as the legislation that would support your either your education or your loved one's education free access within the public school systems. Civil rights statute, the way this exists, does not involve any specific funding to states or to school systems, but rather provides policy guidance and technical assistance to school districts, students, parents, and advocates. So if you ever had needs for information or better understanding about policy, this is a place to start related to student discrimination on the basis of disability. The OCR will also receive discrimination complaints from parents, students, or advocates, and in application, they refer back within the school district for early complaint resolution. So they don't adjudicate complaints, but rather help guide the process of solving any discrimination issues. What does Section 504 require or involve? It requires every public school system to provide what's called free and appropriate education. You'll hear people abbreviate this to the term FAPE or FAPE, to each qualified student with a disability. And within Section 504, this can be either through the general education setting, or what I might call the mainstream classroom, or through special education services. What is free and appropriate education? Within the confines of Section 504, we're referring to the idea that students with disabilities are ensured appropriate education services designed to meet their individual needs to the same extent as the needs of the students with disabilities in the system are met. So this is about leveling the playing field in a way, providing services that give the same access to the qualified student with a disability. Something for you to know when it comes to kind of application of this information is that school districts have a mandated process for identifying 504 eligible students. So it's not entirely on your shoulders as a parent to initiate this process. There are mechanisms in place, for example, what's called the Child Find program, that assists school districts in identifying students that will be eligible for 504-based services. This does include both a process of evaluation for the student with the disability and provides due process when there's any type of dispute or complaint. Who's a qualified student? This turns out to be really important. I'm going to talk to you about what constitutes a qualified student under Section 504, and it's different than what constitutes a qualified student under IDEA. So the qualified student under Section 504 must be determined to have a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities, have a record of such impairment, or be regarded as having such an impairment. And for any of those in the room that have any experience with the Americans with Disabilities Act, there's a lot of similarity here in terms of definition. When we get into the area of major life activities, because that really is the crux of how and why students with disabilities qualify for Section 504, these will include a realm of different activities. It is not an exhaustive list, though. There are statutes that define these areas, and I've pulled up the ones that are most relevant, I think, to living with epilepsy. These will include things like manual tasks, walking, seeing, hearing, learning, working, reading, concentrating, thinking, and communicating. So as you can see, there's a multitude of what are called major life activities that can be affected by epilepsy or the consequences of living with epilepsy. And major life activities includes major bodily functions, so we can think of those around the area of neuropsychological and neurological functioning or brain functioning. Here's an interesting thing to understand about Section 504. A student may take medication or use other anti-seizure or accommodation devices which control the epilepsy and its impairments and still be a qualified student. So just because the young person is not actively having seizures during the day or they're well controlled does not disqualify them for services under 504. Shifting gears. So I want to contrast section of 504 with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, or IDEA. This piece of legislation is different from Section 504 in that this is a grant statute, and the function is to support special education programs at the federal level. And so IDEA is administered by the U.S. Department of Education within the Office of Special Education and Rehabilitative Services, or OSERS, as we will sometimes fondly refer to it. And OSERS provides funding to individual states, which also then implement their own funding as well to implement special education programs within the public school system. And I'm going to bring this up a few other times in my talk today. So one thing I want to mention now is that one of the premises, both with Section 504 and especially with IDEA, is that the child is served in what's called the least restrictive environment. And this can end up being fairly appropriate at the level, or fairly important at the level of seeing how your child is being accommodated within the school systems, because there are likely to be times when the least restrictive environment is in the general education classroom as opposed to a special education classroom. The idea here being that that students across the board are better off when students are more appropriately integrated within classroom settings and don't unnecessarily impinge upon the learning abilities of students with disabilities. So the IDEA entitles eligible students with disabilities, and this is going to be a different definition than what I just talked with you about, to free and appropriate education also. One of the things that's important if you're learning about the educational process or system within Washington State is that the State Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction sets the special education standards, and that this will also include preschool age children, and that one of the requirements under IDEA is that each individual student has what's called an individualized education plan, or an IEP. Who's a qualified student under IDEA? This is where things get a little bit different and may be more challenging to meet the definition relative to Section 504. So the qualified student must be determined to have a disability or disabilities, and this disability or disabilities adversely affect educational performance. So there needs to be a much more explicitly delineated link between the disability and an adverse impact on education. The student's unique needs cannot be addressed through education in general classroom settings alone, with or without accommodations, and requires specially designed instruction, again in the least restrictive environment. So hopefully you can see how this is a more narrow or a more significant level of definition for somebody to need to rise to based on their epilepsy. That said, there are 13 different categories of medical condition under which a student with a disability can qualify for IDEA. And epilepsy is specified under the category of other health impairment. And of course, a student may qualify under more than one category, but I want to draw your attention to the fact that epilepsy is named in the other health impairment area. I'm going to switch back to talking about 504 now. So now that you have kind of a general understanding of each of the pieces of legislation and how they view students with epilepsy, I want to talk to you about how the educational plans are developed and what's involved in that kind of thing. So with the 504 plan, and this is different than an IEP. As I mentioned, the qualifications are not as stringent, and therefore your student or a student that you have within your school or you yourself may qualify for a 504 plan, but not qualify for an IEP. And the 504 plan is a plan for how the child will have access to free and appropriate public education, which basically is learning, regardless of the classroom setting. And its function is to outline the accommodations and basically services or environmental changes to meet the students' learning needs as adequately as other students. And the caveat that I want you to be thinking about is that this may be a better option for those whose learning is not significantly impeded by their seizures, their medications, the effect of their seizures, that kind of thing. So a little case study here to kind of highlight and walk you through the thinking around 504 plans. In what situation might a 504 plan be indicated? So I've got the case of Joey here that I'll describe to you. And Joey he's 13 years old. He's an 8th grader at Jones Middle School. This is fabricated, as you might understand, but he's enrolled in basic classes for 8th grade. He has average intelligence. He's quiet by nature. His GPA ranges, depending on the class, from a 2.0 to a 2.9. So that's about C or better work. He interacts well with his peers and teachers. He has absence seizures 1 to 2 times a week or 4 to 8 times a month. And Joey comes from a supportive home with a mother, father, and 2 siblings, and is doing quite well in spite of his seizure problem. And just out of curiosity, does anybody want to take a stab at why Joey might be, just looking at what I've put here, a better candidate for 504 plan as opposed to an IEP under the IDEA? That's right, yeah. So he's doing pretty well academically. He's at grade level. His seizures are relatively well controlled. So because he's performing on grade level, the least amount of intervention is indicated. The school absolutely should take a step in sharing with Joey's parents that in the future, if things were to change, Joey could be assessed and might qualify for more extensive services, and that special education services could be an option if Joey needs more assistance later on and if he qualifies. So in this situation, a 504 plan is going to be the better option. Who develops these plans, who's involved, that kind of thing. So typically the 504 committee includes the parent. Interestingly, the law does not require that parents have to be involved, but it is recognized as an aspect of best practice, and certainly if you're involved with your child and advocating within the education system, chances are that you're aware of being involved. The committee will also include a guidance counselor, the lead instructional teacher, general education teachers, and in instances where indicated, a health services professional, if there are health service related needs for the individual student. So I have this as a maybe. It's not necessarily a mandated component of the team, but may be required in some cases. The committee composition that I've listed here will vary by school districts, and in general, school districts do have systematic and published information over how they approach the 504 process. And I know I live within the Lake Washington School District and was pretty easily able through, an internet search to pull up the district's special education and 504 accommodation related information. If you can't find it online, it's typically something that the school district has readily available to provide to families. We'll contrast that with starting the IEP process. So again, this is the process related to special education. And the IEP process will start with what's called referral and assessment. And a referral for an individualized education plan can come from any party. So this can come from the parents, the teachers, a doctor, a school counselor, so anybody that's working with that child. And usually happens under the auspices of some level of observation of academic difficulties. Again, you remember what defines a qualified student, and we've got that element of the disability adversely affecting school performance. So usually by this point, there's some record that the student has been struggling academically. Once the referral is made, the district has a defined period of time to conduct an evaluation of the student and determine if that child qualifies for special education. Typically, the school district will undertake this process, although it is possible as the parent to contribute your own records as well, and I'll talk to you about what some of those records are and why they might be valuable. And the school district will also include its own, or conduct its own standardized assessment of the child and formulate an education plan. So in most instances, even if you show up with a very comprehensive kind of file of medical information, the school district is also going to have the pieces that they'll include in an evaluation as well. Once the child has been evaluated and deemed eligible for special education, then the formulation of the IEP occurs. And again, there's a time frame defined by law under which this needs to happen. Interestingly, and I point this out because this can become a point of confusion for some parents, the district will seek parents' consent to the service, and sometimes parents will confuse receiving that request for consent to the service with agreeing to the IEP. And so there are times when parents will withhold their consent because they're concerned that that means they're agreeing to an IEP that either they don't know the details about or that they haven't been, that they don't yet agree with. So just want to point that out, especially if I've got parents and also for nurses just in the process of educating parents that this is a consent to the process, not to the actual plan. And the IEP is the Qualified Students Education Program. This will take the form of kind of within the plan as you look at it, educational goals, functional goals, along with identification of every support that's needed in order to meet those goals. So I would kind of say that in a lot of situations it's detailed in a much different way than a 504 plan, which is more aimed at specifying accommodations. The IEP is an ongoing agreement between the family and the school, and the plan is developed in a meeting that includes the parents. It will also include a mainstream or regular education teachers if the services are provided in a mainstream education classroom, a special education teacher, and also a person that's knowledgeable of the student's needs. So the key here is that that individual is somebody who is able to interpret the instructional implications of the evaluation, because the evaluation will most times produce a lot of information about areas where the student is having challenges, most likely cognitively related to learning or related to behavior. And it's important to have somebody on the team that is able to translate that information to what it means when it comes to instruction with a student. And often there's also a school district representative involved in the meeting as well. And the last little bit here that's probably pretty challenging for a lot of you to see is that everything that goes into the IEP is a team decision based on the folks that are in this meeting that I'm talking about. So that, for parents and nurses in the room, that's probably the key time where you're able to advocate for particular services or elements of your child's education program for the year. IEPs may include related services, and these are supportive services that will facilitate the child's goals. And so I've listed off a number of them. This isn't an exhaustive list, but probably the most common services that we'll see within school districts. These are things like speech and language therapy, audiology, counseling, school health services, interpreting services, occupational and physical therapy, social services, and mobility services. The individualized education plan is effective for 1 year, and they can be adjusted or modified at any time during the year. What you'll see is that a new IEP will not be written, but instead a modification to the existing IEP will be made. At the time of renewal, at that 1 year mark, then a new education program can be developed. But for the 1 year, the original plan that's formulated and agreed upon at the IEP meeting is what is put in place. Another important piece I think to know is that students must undergo updated assessment and evaluation. Usually this is testing. At least once every 3 years, and the team can request this to happen sooner, especially if there are clear reasons to do this, whether it's changes within the student's presentation or learning or that kind of thing. And I'd say probably the most important thing for parents and school staff in the room to know is that ongoing team communication is really crucial to successful implementation and monitoring of these plans. All right, so another case to kind of highlight here why an IEP should be considered. So this time we have Mary. And Mary is a 4th grader at Southwest Elementary. She's below grade level in reading and math. Mary reads at a 1st grade level. In math, she can add and subtract, but is not yet able to do more complicated operations. Mary has generalized convulsive seizures twice per week. Mary is an only child, and her parents are supportive and knowledgeable. Her family has moved frequently. There's question about the cause of Mary's low reading and math levels. Does anybody want to kind of take a stab at why Mary compared to Joey would be a more appropriate IEP candidate?
She's below grade level.
Right. Yeah. So 2 key things here. She's got significant seizures that are not well controlled, and she is performing significantly below grade level, and that information is clear. So the recommendation would be that the teacher or the parent make an IEP referral to the school team. And likewise within school districts, there are, most school districts have really nicely formulated policies and procedures in place that are accessible to concerned others and students. One idea is that a classroom observation could be done to take a closer look at Mary's behavior in the learning environment. There may be things in the environment that are either impeding her process or facilitating her learning process. If there isn't one on file, the family absolutely could have an outside NPE. Here is my shorthand for neuropsychological evaluation. So an outside neuropsychological evaluation can fortunately outline any additional possible learning needs and give some information about potential causes to learning problems. And when the results are complete, parents and school personnel will then meet to decide on the best placement, again, in the least restrictive environment. So I haven't talked about it much in my presentation up until now, but I do want to highlight the role that neuropsychological evaluations can play when it comes to learning and successfully managing epilepsy within the school setting. And neuropsychological evaluations can give extremely detailed information that I'll get into in a little bit, talking about accommodations that have the potential to really give a lot of fruitful direction or guidance for thinking about the students' learning needs. Before I do that, I want to talk about something called a seizure action plan, because in both instances, whether it's a 504 plan that's being developed for the student or under IDEA and putting together an individualized education plan, I just want to stress the importance of having a comprehensive seizure action plan in place. And I want to give due credit to the Epilepsy Foundation. They've got an awesome seizure action plan template available online. It's a 1 to 2 page document and really walks you through all of these key elements that you're going to want to spell out for the student and the medical care and seizure care for the student. This will the seizure action plan will instruct the school personnel on how to respond when a student has a seizure. This document is not a legally protected or enforceable document in its own right, so it has to be added to the 504 plan or to an IEP. So even if all you need for your child is basic seizure care at school, then you're going to want a 504 plan so that you can have this information included. The pediatric neurologist can assist with the seizure action plan, and there's actually a place for him or her to sign it. And this is something that generally should be updated on an annual basis, sooner if needed, and provided to all necessary school personnel. So this includes teachers, aides, coaches, that type of thing. And essentially what's in the seizure action plan is descriptive information about your child's seizures. And this will include triggers and postictal states, information about how the child is or what kind of factors are important to consider pre and postictally. There's room for basic and first aid instructions, including how and when to have the child return to class. And the hope here is that the child is able to return to class as soon as reasonably expected after a seizure. And as I'm sure most of you know, that will vary from child to child. It also has parents outline an emergency protocol and what constitutes an emergency. And that, as you can imagine, keeps school systems from implementing emergency procedures when they're not needed, and also ensures that they do act appropriately when it is a emergency. Descriptive information, things like medication dosages, when the medications are taken, if the child has a VNS, any other kind of device. What I think is also important on this form is to include any information you want the teacher or another adult present in the room to record during the seizure. So things like duration, any behavioral changes, any loss of consciousness, unresponsiveness, breathing problems. And again, I'll praise the template that's online. It's terrific.
Hey, Art.
Yes.
We do have
Please.
Copies of the seizure action plan on our table out there in the lobby if you'd like to pick one up. But
Great.
It's also available online, but there's hard copies on our table.
Good, good. So the hard copies on the table outside. Thanks, Kevin. Excellent. What other information should you have on file when it comes to gather, and when I say on file, I mean kind of at your disposal or in your records as you prepare for either a 504 plan meeting or an IEP. Neurological records or medical records can be key pieces of information that outline details around the child's seizure activity, but also in any information from parents or educators, physicians too, regarding the effect of the epilepsy on the student's major life activities. And the more detailed that you can be with this information, the better. So if you can get down to the details of side effects on medications or how the student is affected, maybe it's fatigue or confusion after a seizure, that kind of thing, the better. Any educational evaluations are helpful to have on hand. A list of the child's medications with known and potential side effects. If you've got one, a neuropsychological evaluation, this will outline any information related to memory, language functioning, executive functioning, or how a student kind of plans and executes learning activities, motor functioning, that type of thing. Teacher observations and school records can be helpful, especially if other evaluations have been conducted previously. And probably most importantly is also having any attendance or disciplinary records. This can be really helpful, particularly in teasing out if there are discipline issues that may have been applied because of seizure activity, and starting to tease out what's overt behavior that needs to be disciplined versus behavior that's a consequence of epilepsy. And then you also want to have some rationale for the referral for the 504 or IEP. So one of the questions that I wanted to be able to address with you today is really the idea around what are educational accommodations? What do we mean when we start to talk about altering the child's learning environment to ensure kind of a level playing field for that student? So one of the things, if you're involved in this process, to be thinking about is what accommodations or modifications to the educational environment does this child need in order to have the same educational access as everybody else? And I've got a few categories here that I list, and then I want to give you a way for kind of thinking about how to approach accommodation strategies. One of the things I think that's important to keep in mind is being prepared for accommodations related to the seizure activity itself, but then also around any post-ictal or post-seizure behavior. And you might think about accommodations as they relate to the child's curriculum, so the information that's delivered to the child, rules within the school and within the classroom, and also any grading policies. And a lot of times parents really want to know, maybe sometimes with the curriculum it's not as challenging, but they want to know, well, am I allowed to have my student be granted extra time to take a test, or an extra week to, to meet a deadline on an assignment if they had a seizure the night before the assignment was due, that kind of thing. So I want to talk to you first about common impairments. This is not in any means exhaustive, but just to get some ideas going about the kinds of impairments that students with epilepsy might have, and then I'm going to talk about how those can be accommodated. So we can be thinking in terms of medication side effects. You know, most of these are mild, but from time to time, students will experience more severe side effects. So you may want to be planning for checking in periodically with the neurologist for dosing or medication administration to help, but also that neurologist can help you identify additional possible side effects that you want to have prepared in a list for the school. With memory, having epilepsy might affect memory in terms of both seizure activity, but the issue may also relate to medications, and either is applicable in this scenario. Students may have really focal or pronounced memory challenges just around the seizure activities, and things kind of come back to normal after that, or we see students who also have more ongoing challenges with memory. Again, both are applicable, but you want to think about which is the case for the student of focus. And as I mentioned earlier, I'm going to give one more plug on the neuropsychological evaluations, that these can help identify and describe memory impairments. For concentration, I have the same comments about memory. And likewise, actually, fatigue can be an issue for some kids with the medications that they take, and you can be thinking about what accommodations might a student need related to fatigue. One other area that will be called out during a 504 planning meeting or an IEP planning meeting is the student's behavioral presentation or behavior change. And so you might want to be thinking about whether the child's seizures cause behavior changes or problems, or are they associated with them. And here I'm thinking about disruptive behavior, so aggression, irritability, hyperactivity. Is there a need, or do you want to be really pointed about a lack of need for restraint, during a seizure, and also describing any postictal depression or withdrawal that can happen for some kids. Be prepared to describe the manner that these behaviors that your child displays are related to the epilepsy. Again, this helps the school personnel separate this from more disciplinary action type of issues. And this also helps ensure that these kinds of behaviors get included in the 504 plan. You may also need to be prepared, as I mentioned, to talk about your student's discipline record, particularly if your student has been disciplined for behavior that is disability related, which wouldn't be okay, right? So it's important that that get teased out for some students. Thinking about how to organize accommodation needs. Bob and I, over the years of working with each other, have really kind of gotten behind this idea of thinking about accommodations in 3 broad categories for how to kind of go after this. One is what changes can be made within the environment, to the classroom, the student's learning space. The second is what kind of changes to processes or how things are done can be made. And the third is consideration of any kind of assistive technology or devices that would accommodate the student. I advocate that these are important to consider and think through as parents and as staff in advance of the meeting, and that as parents you try to be as specific as possible in connecting the accommodation need to the specific functional impairment or disability issue for the child. So I want to talk about some ideas for accommodations. These aren't the only way to address these problems, but these are more common and hopefully start to give you a flavor of problem solving, if that's something that's relevant for you. With accommodating for medications within the school system, this may be something like allowing the child to take medications when scheduled, which could also involve helping the child remember to take these medications, or recruiting school staff to assist in this process. With memory difficulties, this can take a whole bunch of various forms, but here we're thinking of things like the teacher providing notes, or if a teacher uses presentation information, that can get provided to the student, that the teacher is checking often for understanding with the student or reviewing content additionally, asking the student to repeat taught information back to ensure understanding, or even allowing students to record. So I'm thinking more maybe the high school level where students might be listening to a lecture and allowing them to record that information so that they can listen to it again later to help with encoding and memory. Other ideas, teacher check-ins, assignment notebooks with teacher and parent support. So kind of organizational strategies, presenting the material in a variety of ways. So having visual graphics for students, having verbal information, doing things that are hands-on. Graphics organizers are another type of tool, and these can be hand-constructed. You can find online templates for them, but they can help with really reinforcing and putting information in a tangible way for the student. Accommodations for concentration, and I think a lot of these can apply for fatigue too. So if a student is really heavily fatigued after a seizure or series of seizures, I think a lot of these ideas can apply in that scenario as well. But with concentration difficulties, we think about prompting the student frequently. So this student might get more frequent prompts to stay on task than the other students. Positive reinforcement, so rewarding the student for on-task focused behavior. Frequent breaks, visual reminders or other cues that help the student stay on task. This one comes up a lot, and people want to know if it's okay, and it's definitely a reasonable accommodation, but extended time on tests or assignment deadlines. Likewise, potentially breaking long assignments into separate smaller assignments or separate smaller parts that the student achieves. Rescheduling assignments after a seizure, or allowing a flexible assignment deadline process, essentially. And the other one is testing at certain times of day. So the math test that your student is supposed to have at 3 o'clock on Fridays may need to be rescheduled to 9 o'clock on Tuesdays because it's earlier in the week and your student by Friday afternoon is fairly kind of punkish from a week of fatigue and whatnot. So accommodations around seizure activity can include things like having school personnel keep a record or a logbook. I want to also encourage you to be thinking about social accommodations because your child is not in an educational environment kind of in their own vacuum, but there's very much a social element to having epilepsy, and teachers might be thinking about how they can give group assignments to students, especially if a student has missed some work. A group assignment can help with catching that student up. Also peer education within the classroom. So I'll give you a resource in just a moment about really nice developmentally appropriate information to give to the rest of the students in the classroom that's constructive and helps with building some understanding of the lived experience for the student with epilepsy. It's also just as important to avoid behavioral restrictions that are not indicated, so over-restricting the child in a way that's not consistent with the impairments that they have from their epilepsy, because this can contribute to feelings of stigma or social isolation. All right, one last time, maybe. On the neuropsych eval. A well-done neuropsych eval will give you suggestions for accommodations, and as a parent or a school system advocate, discussing this in advance with the neuropsychologist so that that professional knows what questions you want targeted can be really helpful. Okay, good. So I have just resources listed for you here. I want to say that the resources through the Epilepsy Foundation on educational aspects for kids are awesome. And so I would definitely encourage you to be in touch with the Epilepsy Foundation if you've got questions about 504 plans or IEPs. I want to list off some that I found really useful as I was kind of playing around with formulating my slides. The Washington State Office for Superintendent of Public Instruction produces what they call technical assistance papers that are aimed at helping parents understand IDEA and IEPs, and they're nice kind of 2-page documents, and they run the spectrum of breaking down the different parts of the IDEA and what they mean to just kind of the basics. What do you need to know to get started in special education with a student? As I mentioned before, many school districts publish their special education and 504 processes online. And I'll just kind of make a general comment here too, that as a parent, if there are problems, and a lot of times these processes will spell this out, but it's often best to start with the teacher in your child's classroom and then discuss upstream with others, meaning like school administration, principal, that type of thing, as needed, but starting with the teacher is really a great way to go. The Office of Civil Rights website has an FAQ page on protecting students with disabilities. The website I mentioned earlier about education for other students in the classroom is called www.epilepsyclassroom.com, and it has lesson plans for grades K through 12 for teaching other kids about epilepsy and what it's like to have epilepsy, and hopefully that sensitizes the other children in the classroom to what that experience is like and helps them relate to the student with epilepsy. And darn, down in the dark part of the slide, once your child turns 14, and I think Bob got at this a little bit earlier in his presentation too, but once your child turns 14, she or he can also begin participating in transition programs in partnership with the Division of Vocational Rehabilitation, and this can be a great way to get your student thinking about life beyond school and also thinking about work and that kind of thing. And I think that's it. I'm happy to entertain questions. Just as a bit, my one last plug around neuropsychologists and neuropsychological evaluations is there are some awesome neuropsychologists here at Children's. Hillary Shurtleff and Molly Warner do great work evaluating youngsters with epilepsy and giving productive information. If you need other names for folks out in the community, I'm happy to make suggestions as well if you live out of the area, that kind of thing. But I just want to thank you, and I'm happy to try to address any questions.
At the beginning, when you were talking about 504s, you said that it could be just be regarded as a disability. I always thought that there needed to be a medical diagnosis. So can you explain a little bit more what be regarded would refer to?
So there may be situations in which a child doesn't have a formal diagnosis or doesn't qualify, meaning meeting diagnostic criteria, but is regarded or viewed by others as having a disability. You mean who determines whether a student is regarded as? Usually that's something that there's some background. I'm sorry, I'm just trying to kind of bring the slide back up to see if that'll help. Typically, the family will have information that kind of substantiates that perspective, whether it's records of unusual behavior, records of other types of issues. In the case of epilepsy, if somebody's got documented seizure activity, it's a kind of a non-starter, as I would say.
My son's got an IEP, seizure action plan.
Oh, I need you up here with me.
And also a neuropsych eval that was done here with Jesse Bledsoe here at Seattle Children's.
Good.
He's just entered middle school and has had his IEP since kindergarten, updated regularly.
Uh-huh.
With a new school, what we're encountering is that that IEP, because his seizures are currently well controlled, that there seems to be less emphasis, or less adherence to the IEP. His next meeting with them is in about 10 days. So what I'm looking at is some suggestions you might be able to give me for strategies on encouraging better adherence to that IEP without bringing in, a big hammer.
Yeah.
And to keep that team approach going that we've had such good luck with, but we seem to have hit a stumbling block.
Yeah. That's a great question, and if I don't, I'm not likely to get into it in enough detail right now, so I'd be happy to talk with you outside as well. But generally, I think about encouraging communication and also really positively and quickly responding to to when things go well. So when the IEP pieces or steps are implemented well, really, actively letting the staff know how grateful you are, how pleased you are, that kind of thing, like really reinforcing those efforts. And when things aren't coming through the way you thought they were, asking questions. Because it's not always clear at the face value of kind of what's behind a step being missed, whether it was an accidental oversight or if they don't have the capacities, this kind of thing, and perhaps asking a prompt question about an issue. But I'd love to kind of talk more about your specific situation outside, if that would be helpful. Okay, good.
Last question, and then Erico, I'm sure, will be around after that to take more.
My question was kind of more of a comment relating to your plug about Epilepsy Foundation. We've had several problems with implementing IEP, and I found humongous help on the Epilepsy Foundation website. You can actually print off, it's over 100 pages, and it would be helpful for the school nurses in the room, the parents in the room, but it distinguishes between a 504 and IEP. It gives you case examples, different things that you can talk about in relation to the IEP, what might be falling through the cracks for that gentleman where they're not relating. So that's a really great resource. It's very lengthy, but it is really worth looking at, and I printed it and made it a binder. So.
Oh, good. Yeah, thank you for that extra kind of description. I agree, the resources are awesome. Oh, one more. Can we do one more?
You know, as a school nurse, we're kind of caught in the middle a lot of times between families like this that really are advocating for their student, and also between teachers who have in a general education class maybe 12 kids on an IEP all over the spectrum, and they're still trying to meet the needs of every single student across the board. And honestly, I would never be an educator, but because it's so difficult on their demands. And I'm wondering, you know, is there kind of a medium ground where you have supports for teachers like that? Because all these accommodations are great and we can put them into place. And then the reality is, you know, how does one single teacher, like in elementary where I work, but then you go into middle school and secondary education where you have volumes of classes. And, you know, I've had students myself, my kids have been on IEPs. I'm kind of like see across the board where it's difficult for every single person along the way. So where, you know, how do we support our teachers?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. When we ask teachers kind of what are the challenges about accommodating students, a lot of times it's lack of information about epilepsy, and so sometimes even being able to provide effective information about epilepsy ends up being more valuable than we think it's going to be. You know, if you're living with epilepsy or you have a loved one with it, you have a tremendous wealth of information kind of implicitly stockpiled, and the teachers don't always necessarily understand that. But also, I like the question because sometimes thinking about simple solutions for more complicated behavioral issues can be helpful also, or a solution that works in for multiple issues. Because I agree, I think hats off to the teachers, and there's a lot that they're juggling. It isn't that unusual, or it isn't common, you know, that it's one student in the classroom anymore with an IEP, but quite often many of them, yeah. Okay, thanks again. Enjoy the rest of your day.